Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Apex Health Summit. Thank you, Madeline Milka, for hosting this great event. I'm excited to have all of you join us for the discussion entitled Saving Lives and the Future of Innovation in the Industry. Today, I will be hosting a fireside chat with an important leader in healthcare, followed by a dynamic panel focused on innovation in the industry. We first turn to a great leader in the industry, Dr. Jan Tsai of Novartis. Dr. Tsai, it's great to speak with you today.
Thanks for having me here, Irene.
Of course. You're the head of global drug development and the chief medical officer for Novartis, a healthcare company headquartered in Switzerland. Let's start at the beginning. I'm sure the audience is interested to learn more about you. So can you share a little bit about how you got to where you are today and your role at Novartis?
Yeah, thanks. Really excited to be here and looking forward to having a discussion about advancements and innovation in healthcare. Yeah, I actually have been at Novartis for 4 years, but maybe to give you some background on how I landed in this role. I was actually born in Taiwan and I moved to the United States when I was 7 years old. And my parents moved to, of all places, Louisville, Kentucky. So often when I'm giving talks or talking to other people, I ask them if they can actually even identify where Louisville is on a map. And people often point to somewhere in the Midwest because they don't know where Kentucky is. And it was a great place to really grow up and learn a lot about diversity. But in fact, as I was growing up in Louisville, I was the only Asian kid in my grade school. I think I was one of two Asian kids in high school. And it taught me a lot about diverse opinions, diverse approaches, and different ways of thinking about answers to different problems. And in fact, with that background, I also had a real curiosity to learn more about how we bring different pieces together. And with that curiosity, I actually went into engineering school, and that was not a surprise for many of my friends who I hung out with when I played basketball or when I played on the football team. They knew that I was going to go into engineering, and they said, "We knew you were going to go there." And I got an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering. As part of that, my first job out of college was to work for GE Medical Systems. And when I started to work for GE Medical Systems, I understood the implications and took me further in the area of curiosity to understand how the human body works and the importance of understanding and how the different pathophysiology of the way that humans are developed. And that drove me actually to go back into medical school. And this is where I ended up getting a MD degree and trained in San Francisco, in fact, and where I practiced for a number of years and saw the different diverse treatment disparities across the country, whether that would be in California or in Kentucky. And I knew based on that experience that I didn't really want to just have an impact on one patient at a time. I wanted to have a larger impact on healthcare. And I'm lucky enough to have that experience, in fact, and work through a number of different pharmaceutical companies, developing clinical studies where I've actually worked for pharmaceutical companies over the last 20 years or so, and lucky to be here in Basel, where I'm leading the Global Drug Development Organization at Novartis.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Dr. Tsai. That's so interesting. You've really been around the world in your, your formative years and your career. Now, today, you lead the development of one of the strongest and largest pipelines in the industry, with 70 new molecular entities, 165 clinical development projects, and with the potential to treat over 50 diseases. Clearly, innovation drives your company and your portfolio. Novartis has invested heavily in the advanced therapy platforms over the years. How do you ensure access to these new and highly innovative treatments?
Such a great question because I think we're at such a crossroads in science right now. There's so much innovation that has come through, and I think there's no better time than currently now in science in the advancements that we've made as you talk about these advanced therapy platforms, Irene. So maybe we start there and we'll talk about where we can actually ensure that we bring these medicines to patients. I think many people know that we've been actually looking and exploring advancements in RNA therapies. And over the last 20 years, significant advancements have been made in RNA therapies. And hence, what we saw was the potential for a vaccine to be developed for COVID in less than a year. The traditional model for developing vaccines typically took 25 years, and we were able to shorten that by a tremendous amount of time. Also, what we're seeing currently in the science world is gene therapies. And we've brought a number of gene therapies to market. We at Novartis have one of the two gene therapies out in the marketplace. And we actually treat a disease called spinal muscular atrophy in babies that actually have a potential likelihood of death and survival less than 2%. And these babies are growing up to be full grown adults with a one-time gene therapy treatment. We're also seeing the advancements in oncology, targeted therapies, which have allowed for longer lives for patients. And whether that would be in lung cancer, what you've seen in melanoma, whether you've seen in prostate cancer, these are all the advancements that have been progressed through various pipelines. And I think there's no better time to be in science than currently at this time right now. But we also know that the science is not of value unless we can actually bring them to patients. And that's the critical element here is we make significant advancements, but we have to bring the two together to ensure that patients can get access to these medicines. So as I think about drug development and how we bring a drug to patients, we first start with patients at our core. We think about what's the unmet need out there? How many patients are impacted? What are the ways that we can actually ensure that we deliver these drugs to patients? And how do we ensure that they actually are part of the solution, even when we're designing these clinical trials? So what's really critical is, one, we think about the design of the clinical trial from the patient's standpoint so that they can be part of the solution in the way that we actually are bringing them to the clinics when we have these clinical trials. Two, the other thing that we want to ensure that we do is once we work with the regulators, once we get the results from our studies, we want to ensure that the patients actually have access to these medicines. So a couple of examples that might be really helpful to put this into context for us. We have a drug that's called Leqvio. It is a what we call small interfering RNA particle that decreases your LDL. And what does LDL do? Well, elevated LDL levels leads to heart disease, which we all know is the number one killer for all of the entire world, in fact, even despite the most recent pandemic. Cardiovascular disease is still the number one killer. This Leqvio compound actually is given twice a year. And with this twice a year injection, what you can do is bring down your LDL levels by 50%. And so what we've actually started to do was partner with healthcare systems around the world. Instead of going through having each physician write a prescription, we're working with various healthcare systems, such as in the UK. We're working with different HMOs and various different pharmaceutical benefits companies to ensure that we can deliver these drugs to patients so that when they go and follow up with their physicians after they've had a heart attack, that they can gain access to it instead of going physician by physician. So this is a different way of looking at ensuring that we can deliver Leqvio to these patients. That's one example. A second example, perhaps in terms of ensuring access for patients, is now on the earlier side. What I gave was an example once a drug has been approved. Let's go a little bit earlier about development of drugs in the actual development process. Well, we have advanced a drug that actually looks at what we call complement factor B. Complement factor is what helps stimulate your immune system and is part of your immune system. But sometimes your immune system is overactive. And when it's overactive, it actually begins to degrade different cells in your body. And that degradation product ends up in your kidneys. And the kidneys, actually, what ends up happening is once it's actually over taxed, your kidneys, they begin to end up with patients end up with renal failure as an end result. Now, unfortunately, this happens at a very young age for patients. And this is a disease, what we call IgA nephropathy. So in our pipeline is a drug that we're studying for IgA nephropathy. And the what's known here for IgA nephropathy, in fact, is that it predominantly affects patients of Asian descent. So there's about 1.3 million patients with IgA nephropathy. About a million of those patients out of the 1.3 million actually are Asian. So in fact, and the worst part of this is that the disease actually leads to renal failure for very young patients, anywhere from 20 to 40 years old. So it is not a disease of older patients, it's a disease of very young patients. So what we've started to do was, one, we understand that it affects the Asian population. We've started to conduct these trials, not only obviously in the US, but we've started to go into Asia, and we're conducting these trials in China and other parts of Asia, including Japan, to recruit these studies. And once we read out the results, obviously, we'll find ways to ensure that patients have access to this drug called iptacopan. So those are just two examples, one in the earlier stage of development, two, accessibility of drugs once we actually get it into the marketplace.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sai. That was really informative and able to understand and access your information. Sometimes, when scientists or, people with your kind of background speak to the lay people, it's difficult to follow, but I followed that so well, and the examples were really illustrative of the work that you do. So congratulations. So one theme of today's summit is ensuring health equity and reducing barriers to access. You talked a little bit about that, but particularly in the health equity context is something that we're really interested in. So how are you ensuring that you are developing drugs for patients in all regions around the world? And how are you leveraging data and digital technologies to provide access to clinical trials for diverse populations?
It's
or participants, sorry.
Yeah, no problems. And
Yeah.
we think, as a starting point, as you know, I describe that the patient is our starting point. And being a global pharmaceutical company, we don't think about just developing our drugs for the United States or for Europe. In fact, the way that we have our products out in the marketplace, 1/3 of our company's revenue actually is generated from the US, 1/3 of the revenue is generated from Europe, and 1/3 is from Asia. So it's a really wide distribution of different geographies as we put this together. But also, as we think about the way that we deliver our drugs, we have what we call the managed access programs in addition to our clinical studies. These managed access programs are often before drugs are approved. We want to ensure that patients can have access to them. And so 95% of the requests actually have been approved based on that. And this is represented in 95 different countries. And last year we had close to 13,000 patients receiving our treatments through what we call the managed access program. So again, I start at the tail end because the first approach that we take is, as we have treatments for patients, we want to ensure that's accessible to them. Now let's go again earlier into our development program and to say, how are you ensuring that you recruit patients that are representative of the populations in these diseases? Well, one of the things that we do is we have a significant global footprint around the world. We recruit patients from 65 different countries, and we ensure that it is representation. And last year, we put in a policy for our phase 3 programs that, in fact, what we would do is we would ensure that we recruit broadly across various geographies, and this is what we call the patient and caregiver principles. Based on these principles, we want to ensure that there is minimal barriers, if any barriers, and we identify sites where there are diverse patient populations in particular diseases where they're underrepresented, and ensure that we get representation so that we can reach out to these patients and recruit them in our studies. A second caveat to this is when we started to recruit patients in Asia and in China, and as you know, China has had the healthcare reform in terms of where they changed their regulatory policy. So as we look at our clinical studies, what we've started to do was ensure that China is part of our phase 3, what we call our phase 3, and these are the studies that go into the health authorities for submission and for approval. Previously, what had happened was you would actually do these studies later because there would be a significant delay for what we call CTA approval from countries in Asia. Now that China has changed the approach that they take for health authority approvals for the CTA, we've actually, at the beginning of the design of our registrational trials, include China in all of those programs where these diseases actually have impacts in China. So this has really changed the way that we've looked at ensuring that we also have clinical studies that incorporate Asia as a whole. So specifically, when we look at China, we have the ambition to approve 50 new drug approvals between the year 2020 to 2025. And we're on that journey, and we're on track right now. In 2022, I believe we have around 20 drugs already approved over the last 2 years, and we've got 30 more to go over the next 3 years. So I think that was the part one of your question. And the second part of your question really is around how we incorporate digital capabilities and ensuring that we use the capabilities of digital and data technologies for us to do this. And what we've been able to do is what we call a data digital asset strategy. And so with that one, a couple of different components to this is where we are actually reaching out and having what we call decentralized clinical trials. These clinical trials, in fact, will go out to the individual's homes instead of having patients go to their care centers. The limitation previously of doing this was actually the health authorities were a little reluctant because they said, how can we ensure that the data is robust enough for us to accept into the regulatory filings? I think COVID has really given a real boost in this opportunity. And in fact, during the COVID times, we collected about 90 to 95% of our follow-ups as what we call remote monitoring, having us go out to the patient's homes. So I think that presents a significant opportunity, particularly as we talk about this population, because the Asian population, because there are some people that are very concerned. And I know when I was with my parents, they didn't really understand the consent forms when they went to their doctors, or they asked me to come when I was at a very young age to try to translate for them, even though I was only 10 or 11 years old, on what that meant. Now with this being at the home, it gives you a lot more flexibility in what you can do, because patients don't feel like, you know, they have to drive all the way in. And many of these populations have a hard time going to very academic centers. And this allows a much more democratized way of recruiting into clinical trials. So I've ranted on for a while now, so I'll pause here, Irene. I don't know if you have any other questions.
No, that again, you're just such a great presenter, and talking about, you know, what we can do to address these barriers to access. And I agree. COVID had a lot of downsides, but it did open up these opportunities for more people of diverse backgrounds to participate in these clinical trials. So thank you so much for sharing your story and sharing what you're doing at Novartis and some many exciting things that we get to look forward to. Thank you, Dr. Tsai, for sharing your insights with us and the work that you're doing at Novartis. I'm excited today to introduce the continuation of the panel, Saving Lives and the Future of Innovation in the Industry. I'm joined today by Jan Burt, the President of Strategic Global Resourcing at AmerisourceBergen. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jan. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and the role that you have at AmerisourceBergen?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invite. So my background is I'm actually a pharmacist by education, and I've been in the pharmaceutical, industry for about almost 28 years. And my background is in varying areas of healthcare, pharmacy benefit management, strategic global sourcing, drug risk mitigation, as well as managed care. So I feel like I have a pretty deep understanding of the industry. And my current responsibility for AmerisourceBergen is working directly with all of our manufacturer partners, helping them with their distribution and additional service needs when it comes to their pharmaceutical products.
Thank you so much, Jan. Well, as one of the leading drug distributors, AmerisourceBergen has also seen some challenges over the last 2 years. We'd love to hear a little bit about how you are dealing with these issues in the supply chain and ensuring that drug access during the pandemic. So what innovation models have you developed, and how are you confronting the current supply chain challenges?
Thanks for the question. We've all been struggling over the last 2 years in one way or another. One of the things that AmerisourceBergen realized right away when the pandemic started was we needed to really up our communication level with our customers. So when I say customers, we have a variety of customers. So we serve the customers who are interacting with patients every day, whether that's health systems, physicians' offices, or retail pharmacies. And then we also have our manufacturer partners as our customer. So really trying to understand the needs of our customers and bringing those conversations together to ensure that we understood the issues that were going on in the supply chain and how we could ensure that our customers were getting medication and product on time when they needed it to serve their patients. And we did that in multiple ways. So we absolutely had conversations with our downstream, what we call downstream customers, or the customer serving patients, the pharmacies, on a regular basis, as well as starting town hall sessions so that we kept up communication throughout the pandemic and continued to understand their needs as well, so that we could adjust quickly to what they were needing, but then also understanding what was going on the manufacturer side and connecting those two things together. So while my responsibility is with the manufacturers and having all of my team interacting with manufacturers, also doing town halls, then we were also connecting with our downstream customers to understand what we needed to do to kind of keep the flow of the supply chain going. And two things really came out of that. One was the way that we allocate product or get product to the right place at the right time to serve all communities. We pivoted pretty quickly to understand what was this new need. How could we pivot the way that we were doing things and measuring things to ensure we were getting allocation to the right places and also mitigating hoarding? So we saw that pretty quickly, right? And we needed to make sure that we really understood what everyone needed and that we were getting product out, but that we weren't allowing people and customers to hoard product. So the other thing that we really learned pretty quickly was how quickly we could pivot some of these needs. So we would learn these things on a daily basis and pivot our processes and our systems relatively quickly within 24, 48 hours, which really made us to be in a position to help the customer and to make sure that there wasn't supply disruptions. From From an innovation perspective, we've just had a really great opportunity to innovate, not only learning from our customers, but also helping our customers help communities when it comes to not just the vaccines, but the COVID therapies. So from a vaccine perspective, we have our Good Neighbor Pharmacy, which is our independent pharmacies, and they're out in those rural communities, hard to reach communities where patients really depend on them for support of their health care, and ensuring that those pharmacies were enrolled in the federal retail pharmacy program, which enabled those pharmacies to administer vaccines to those patients. And to date, we've administered over 5 million vaccines, and 55% of those pharmacies actually sit in zip codes that are in the equity kind of index for really being high in that inequality index and ensuring that those patients are getting service. But the other thing from an innovation perspective is really understanding how we can service the patient at the end of the day, and looking at how can we help the supply chain, both upstream and downstream, to get to those places where they need to be. So that was a long answer.
No,
I appreciate
great.
the question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And you touched on a point that I want to follow up on around equity. That's a theme that we keep returning to in this health summit. So what is your company doing to address equity and access issues?
We're really passionate about that, as I'm sure many organizations are. So I touched on the federal retail pharmacy program that is really connected with the government, and that opportunity for these rural pharmacies to support their communities where they're needed most. A couple of the other things that we're doing is, those pharmacies that are helping with those vaccines, they're also doing other things like helping the patients with diagnostics, COVID testing, even getting over-the-counter products, and at the height of the pandemic, getting those prescriptions to those patients' doors instead of having the patient have to come into the pharmacy. So that was really exciting to be able to be a part of that. In addition, we have a lot of interactions with our pharmaceutical manufacturer partners. We do have an entity within AmerisourceBergen called Lash Group, and Lash has done a tremendous job of working with manufacturers in patient support programs. So ensuring that we're reaching out to patients in those communities, ensuring that they understand how to navigate kind of their medical insurance, lack of insurance. How can we help them get the services and the benefits that they need in a timely manner? And in addition to that, we also have in that same group telehealth as well as field nursing. So really getting those patients in a telehealth setting, understanding not only what's going on with them from a kind of illness or health perspective, but also understanding what's their support mechanism. Do they have healthcare benefits? Do they have caregivers? How can we help them get the care they need when they need it? And having a nurse or a telehealth on the phone or on your screen has been really comforting to those patients, and it really helps us identify with them. So we're really excited and happy to be a part of that. And then the other thing that AmerisourceBergen does is we do have an AmerisourceBergen Foundation. And one of the key goals of our foundation is to support local communities, especially those communities that are kind of in that low inequity setting. And we put a lot of focus and effort as an organization in that foundation and ensuring that we're addressing those areas. And then I think the last thing that I would just mention, which I think really ties it all together, is AmerisourceBergen has been really the exclusive provider to the government on these COVID therapies. And having that experience with the government and helping the government understand how to allocate product to the states and the states to the communities that need them in a time that they need them, right? Along with where the variants are and where the surges are within each state, each community, and helping the government to get those products to the right places at the right time. It's just been really a humbling experience for us, and we're just really excited to be a part of that.
Well, thank you so much sharing that with us and your story and what you've really been doing the last couple of years, or almost on 3 years now, sadly. But obviously work is so significant and has made a difference, especially in dealing with health equity. So thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's tuned in today. And I hope you all have a great day.